All right, here we go. It is the Awesemo.com NFL Strategy Show, Tuesday, November 19th, 2019. Of course, sponsored and presented, by Yahoo Daily Fantasy Sports, home of the $200,000 baller, 30K NBA baller tonight. All you got to do to get your YSRPs, those Yahoo Sports rewards points, up to $30 upon depositing, is go to awesemo.com, click that NFL tab, and you'll see any of the top free article links. It should get you there. There's a Yahoo link right at the top of all of them, particularly the Showdown ones written by EMAC, or right now, in just a moment, we will drop the link into chat so you can get there yourself. Sign up using this code AWESEMO, AWESEMO. It'll get you up to $30 in YSRPs, those Yahoo Sports rewards points that are as good as cash to be used on the site to play and win real money. It's Yahoo Daily Fantasy Sports, sponsor of the NFL Strategy Show. I'm Dave Lockwood. With me, as always, on Tuesday, Sal Vetri. What's going on, man?
Not much, man. Excited to break down another week with you. How you doing?
I'm doing all right. Not bad. Came across some really interesting numbers when researching this morning. I think we've got a ton to get into, so let's dive right into it with Buffalo and Denver. Buffalo coming off a convincing, albeit obvious win, even though I thought Miami would cover that game. So I guess it wasn't too obvious against the Miami Dolphins. They're in a home spot against the Denver Broncos, who just blew a huge second half lead to the Vikings. Now, this matchup, not nearly as difficult. These are the type of games that Denver wins because Buffalo's offense, despite what we saw last week, is really not all that impressive. There's a lot of holes here, and this game has the lowest total on the entire slate at 37.5. Let's start off with the offensive side of the ball for Buffalo and point out that while Denver blew that lead last week, they are still on the season, according to Pro Football Focus, ranked number 1 in run defense grade and also top 5 in pass coverage. So this is a very stout Denver Broncos defense that appears to only be getting better as the season goes on.
Yeah, I agree. Just looking at Buffalo's side of the ball and what their offense looks like, you had John Brown have a nice game last week, one of the only people so far this season to kind of step in and have a dominating matchup of some sorts against tough cornerbacks. So yeah, John Brown is one of only 2 wide receivers still to have 50 plus receiving yards in every game with Michael Thomas. The price point is at a season high, and it's a spot this week where, another tough matchup for John Brown, and probably not something after a big week last week that I want to get to just because of the matchup and the price point. So Brown doesn't really stand out all that much for me. And the offense, once again, doesn't stand out. You had Josh Allen winning tournaments last week, and he'll do that every so often, especially when he continues to produce on the ground like he has been. But it's really not a spot that stands out in both a tough matchup on the ground, although Singletary's prices come down, and also now a tough matchup in the air. I will point out, though, Isaiah McKenzie's his snap count was a season high and a career high last week for him, and he's kind of stabilizing in as wide receiver 2 on the outside, but it's just not enough production or volume yet to really mean anything in this offense.
Yeah, it's tough. And, Devin Singletary wasn't particularly effective last game, but he still did have some opportunities, which is encouraging. The problem is I just don't know how much you're going to get going against this Denver offense. That's the issue I have. Look, he appears to be taking over here in the Bills' backfield as their leading guy, while Frank Gore still gets worked in, but not a ton. Singletary seeing a lot of snaps. Ran 22 routes last week, and of course, from a snap count perspective, saw the most snaps compared to Frank Gore that we've seen all season, 74 to 26%. So, if you're getting Singletary at a discount, I could understand that, but it's still a really tough spot. I mean, we've seen this Denver defense stifle opposing running backs, better ones than Singletary. So I don't think you need to get there. And there are a few other guys that stand out to me. One of them, not a top play of mine by any means, and there's still a long way to go this week. Things will change. But Philip Lindsay, we heard Vic Fangio and the coaches for the Broncos before last week say, look, Lindsay is going to be our lead guy now. Like, he is going to get most of the work. And we pretty much saw that come to fruition, Sal. He's played 64% of the snaps to 30% for Royce Freeman. Compare that to the past few weeks where Royce Freeman has outsnapped Lindsay had outside Lindsey in 6 consecutive weeks up until this one. He took a huge hit to those snap counts and just time overall on the field. So I do think it's interesting to point out that what they said came true. Lindsey had 16 carries for 67 yards, not a particularly impressive game, but he does seem to be the clear lead back going forward if everything remains true that we saw last week.
Yeah, Lindsey's definitely interesting on this slate. We'll find out as just this show goes on and the week goes on that there's not a lot of value on this slate, it seems, early on. And you do get at least something was behind that. Lindsey seeing over 60% of the snaps. Now, there's been weeks where it's flopped to Freeman seeing 60+%. So there might not be weight to it, but having the coach say something like that's going to happen, more of an involvement for Lindsey, and then it does, is good to see. And now you have Lindsey at a 6-week low in terms of his DraftKings salary, but it seems like the usage is coming up. So it seems like a nice buy low spot for a guy that we have somewhat of a sample of. Well, definitely a better per touch player than his running back mate in Royce Freeman, and now maybe some more usage to go along with it. So yeah, Freeman stands out, or Lindsey stands out at a 0.9 fantasy point per touch type of a player compared to Freeman, who's below 0.8. So giving him more work just makes more sense overall. And if you can get him now at a bottom price point, I kind of like that. He's the main thing that stands out from Denver outside of Noah Fant's usage going up. And that probably relies a little bit on Jeff Heuerman remaining out, where there's 50% of the tight end snaps to just be filled in by Fant.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, we definitely have begun to see more usage for Noah Fant in this passing game. 11 targets last time out. He's seen 23 targets over his last 3 contests, which at least puts him in play as an interesting option here. And then, of course, you're going to have you're going to have Cortland Sutton contending with Tre'Davious White, who allowing one of the lowest passer ratings in the league. I don't believe Tre'Davious White has allowed a touchdown on the season, Sal.
Yeah, I don't believe so either. And then last week, you did have Devontae Parker doing well, but he had like
50, fell down.
Come on. Exactly. He had like 50% of his yardage on Tre'Davious White just falling down in coverage. So he's still, I mean, he's up there as probably a top 5 cornerback this year.
Anything else from this game?
No, nothing really stands out. Tim Patrick, actually, I'll mention Tim Patrick. He got injured, but he came back into the game, caught 4 balls on 8 targets for 77 yards. They've needed a wide receiver too since Sanders has been out, rotating Deontay Spencer and Fred Brown. So this is a big spot to have Tim Patrick come back and actually produce. The downsides are that it's Brandon Allen still throwing the ball, and there's Cortland Sutton and the emergence now of Noah Fant. So it's tough to really rely on that, but he is the flat minimum for a guy who did see usage in his first game back.
Talking Chicago and the New York Giants, another expected low-scoring affair. 40.5 over under here. The Bears are 6-point favorites at home. This one isn't going to give you a whole lot of life either. Now, I guess the big thing is Mitch Trubisky left late in the 4th quarter with a hip pointer, but Coach Matt Nagy said that Trubisky would absolutely remain the Bears starting quarterback in Week 12 against the Giants if cleared to play. Now, I honestly don't know how much of a difference it even makes at this point, Sal, because Trubisky's been pretty brutal. Hell, it might not even be a lateral move if Chase Daniel starts. It might actually be an upgrade. But it comes against the New York Giants defense that has been gashed in pass coverage this season. 28th, of course, according to Football Outsiders in coverage. Pro Football Focus has them 31st in the league. It's been a very rough go for them. And when you look at individual cornerbacks, it doesn't get any better. Do you have, if you want to talk Montgomery first, go ahead, but I've just given up on this guy for now, even against the Giants. If you want to talk him first, we can do that, or we can jump into these pass catchers here. You know, looking at somebody like Allen Robinson, who I wish he was a bit cheaper, and I think he should be based on just the ineffectiveness of this offense. But you'd think that someone has to get something going through the air for the Bears against the Giants. I guess we'll find out.
Yeah, so I can start with the passing game. We'll see what happens with Mitch and Chase Daniels. I don't think it really matters, like you were saying. If Daniels does start in 4 career starts with the Bears dating back to last year, Robinson has 29 targets. Tariq Cohen actually has 34. Robinson leads through 2 games this year on a target share. So they're sort of the hot targets from Daniels if he does go in and start. And also Taylor Gabriel did not see any targets this year because he was injured, but he did see 15 targets in 2 games last year with Daniels. So those are guys that kind of stand out. But for this year, yeah, depending on who starts this week, Allen Robinson will be in play for me at that price point. I honestly would rather have Chase Daniels starting out there, to be honest, in this matchup. But he's just going to have a really good matchup. You've had Janoris Jenkins over the last 4 or 5 weeks or so really turn around his game. on the outside. They're playing a little bit more zone, but when he's playing in man coverage over the last month of the season, only allowing 5 receptions for 34 yards, has an interception in that time. But he's also has not have faced as good of wide receivers as Allen Robinson, who will move into the slot about a third or 25 to a third of his routes run. So you get Allen Robinson in a good spot at a price point coming down. It still feels like it's a little bit high of a price point, but in that 6K range, he's probably the guy who stands out the most. Outside of that, you do have Taylor Gabriel and Anthony Miller were both running a ton of routes last week and on the field a lot. Gabriel's been kind of remaining in that role a little bit more when healthy. But for the most part, just the passing game is really Allen Robinson, and that's about it. Cohen would pique my interest a little bit more, but his price point is all the way up now, I believe, to 4,800. So it's just really hard to get there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's pretty wild too that Anthony Miller played a season high 86% of snaps last week. He was featured pretty heavily in the passing game. There were a couple drives where he was just peppered with targets. He saw 11 targets, second to Taylor Gabriel. Allen Robinson saw 6th. The big thing, though, is you're getting the opportunities with Miller, or at least you did last week or this past Sunday night. But outside of that, we haven't seen anything to suggest that this is sustainable. I mean, he saw 9 targets against New Orleans, had followed that up from a 7-target game against Oakland, and then saw 3, and then 1, and then 2, and now 11. I have a difficult time believing that we can trust the consistency here. Now, he is dirt cheap. I think in tournaments you could make an argument that Miller is viable, but there's no way you go near this guy in cash or single entry tournaments. He could go back to seeing 2 targets, especially if Chase Daniels is at the helm, and we don't really know what type of involvement Miller's going to have.
Yeah, exactly. And also, this team in Chicago, they're trying to play as slow as possible. They only allowed the Rams to run 50 offensive plays for a team that usually likes to run somewhere around 70 plus last week. They're a team that just wants to run the ball. They want to milk the clock, and that's exactly what they were doing for most of last week, just running it down to the last second, even when they didn't have to early in the game. They just want to shorten the game and have less possessions against their opponent, which is the best chance for them probably to win football games. So it's not a really good spot for offensive weapons who usually have kind of peaks and valleys in their volume. So Robinson's a guy who's somewhat consistent that you could rely on. Yeah, Anthony Miller, the price point on him and Gabriel stands out a little bit. And you do have these spike weeks out of them. If they get in a game script where they are actually neutral to leading, they'll probably lean more on the run. So that's concerning. Robinson he's priced for it, but he's the most consistent piece. I do think Miller and Gabriel are fine in GPPs if you are to run some sort of Bears stack and try and get exposure there.
Sakharam Barkley has clearly struggled recently. He had 1 yard on 13 carries last time out. It's been a really tough go for him on all fronts. Now, of course, we know that he's still one of the best players in the league, but since he returned from that injury, Sakharam Barkley has not looked like the same player that we remember seeing last season or even early this season. I mean, in my opinion, there is a lot to be concerned about here. The Bears defense, despite their offense working against them, really has still been strong. But amazingly, you look at Sakharam Barkley, elusiveness rating. If you take anyone that has, say, 50 attempts since he returned from injury in week 7, he is nowhere near the top of the league at all. You've got, let's see, so he's behind Jordan Howard and Latavius Murray has been solid, but I just haven't seen anything to suggest that right now you can play Sakharam Barkley. And there are a bunch of cheap running backs or actual good running backs whose salaries have come down recently. I don't know how you get to Barkley here. Maybe you have a different opinion, but it's going to be tough. Even at 7,900, I think I'd rather go to Ezekiel Elliott against the Patriots.
Yeah, there's a lot of running backs in tough spots, and there's really not a lot of running backs at the bottom end of the pricing this week. So you kind of forced to pay up or go to the mid-range. Barkley stands out as a guy who, if anything, is a GPP type of pivot at what would usually be low ownership. Not a lot of things working in his favor here. Obviously, he's banged up, and he's going to be playing banged up. They said they don't want to shut him down. He specifically said he won't sit and shut down this season. So 17 implied team total, going to be a slow-paced game, 6.5-point underdogs. So maybe you get a little more spike out of his passing game involvement. But at 7,900, I think he's priced for what the role is. But yeah, you touched on it. It's just not a great overall spot. The Bears have been up and down on defense against the run. Bad against the Saints about a month ago. The Eagles had their way 3 weeks ago. Gurley looked good, but they still held him below 5 yards per carry. When you factor in his pass catching role, he had 133 yards last week, Gurley, but they've also had weeks in there where they've shut down the run against the Chargers, who are a pretty nice running team when they had Melvin Gordon back. So it's kind of up and down. It's a spot where if Saquon's ownership comes in low at 7,900, I'll take a chance on it. And the skill set coming off of a bye, maybe he got healthier. It doesn't seem like that's the case from the sentiment we're getting out of there. But just the pace of this game is very scary. You're probably relying on Saquon catching 6 or 7 balls to even get you there, and then touchdown upside to get you into a tournament-winning scorer ceiling out of him. So I like that the price point came down. I like that people will probably be off of him. So if you get 10%, you might be above the field this week.
Here's the biggest issue I have with it. Saquon Barkley, you would agree, relies on chunk plays.
Yeah, definitely.
And the Bears have allowed a league low 2 carries or 2 plays of 20 plus yards on the ground. Only 2. They've allowed the 5th fewest 20 plus yard receptions, which, of course, in Barkley's case is important. That they just don't allow big plays. And for a guy that relies on big plays, I have some serious concerns about that, especially given that he doesn't look to have that same explosiveness that he did before. Are you looking at anything from the Giants?
Yeah, so there's just health statuses that'll be important. Evan Ingram, he has a cloudy status. He seems positive, but he's on the closer part of pushing it for his injury. It was 2 to 4 weeks for a recovery. It's been 2 weeks. They seem doubtful that he'll suit up, but I don't really want to go back to Red Ellison, whose price tag's now up to $3,000 instead of getting him at the flat minimum of tight ends. Sterling Shepard practiced yesterday early in the week, still in the concussion protocol. But here's the thing with Shepard that I think it's interesting because there's arguments against Darius Slayton for both sides for me. Shepard coming back clearly will take volume away from Slayton, who until last week was doing fine on low volume, but we know that that's not something you want to rely on for cash or even GPPs, 4 or 5 targets. You like to see the 14 he had last week. But also Shepard coming back means that he'll get pushed to the outside, and he'll probably draw the tougher matchup on the outside if he does come back this week against Prince Amukamara. Well, you'll get Darius Slayton moving to a much easier matchup against Fuller, who's given up the 3rd most receiving yards in the league this season to wide receivers he's covered in man coverage. So Darius Slayton is probably a guy that I don't get to this week, and it's honestly a better individual matchup for him if Shepard returns, and I'm imagining a lot of the media around it will paint it as a much worse situation for Slayton. But the downside for Slayton is obviously you probably don't get 14 targets. You're probably closer to like 6 for him. So it just really hurts the whole passing game. I actually think Golden Tate, price point at 5,700, is probably my favorite play from the entire team against Buster Skrine in the slot, who's given up 34 receptions, 323 yards, and 2 touchdowns this season. It seems like he's had a good year, but he's also faced Geronimo Allison, Deshaun Hamilton, Trey Quinn, Austin Carr from the Saints, Danny Amendola. It hasn't been the toughest matchups for him in man coverage. So I think Golden Tate's my favorite play from the Giants right now.
Okay. Let's go to Cincinnati and Pittsburgh. We're actually getting the 3 lowest total games out of the way first. This is at 39 points. The Steelers are 6.5 point favorites on the road. The Bengals are the last winless team in the league. They are just a dreadful football team. Defensively, they were a bit better last week against Oakland, but mustered up only 10 points against a bad Oakland defense. I guess one of the big things here is that Joe Mixon has been seeing opportunities no matter what the script is, no matter what direction the game turns, you're still seeing Joe Mixon involved. So, that's encouraging, but I still don't know on this slate, 11 games, some good games, that you need to get to somebody like Mixon here. Gio Bernard played 52% of the snaps last week as well. That's up from 24% when we didn't even know if he was active in week 10. So I think the 30 carry game for Mixon, probably an outlier here. I would expect to see him get back into that 15 to 17 range as a touchdown dog at home. And Tyler Boyd has been, supremely underwhelming. 1 reception for 0 yards last time out. Of course, Ryan Findlay under center doesn't help. AJ Green, we don't know what's going on with him. Auden Tate is questionable to play, dealing with a concussion and a cervical strain. This Cincinnati offense is in utter disarray, and I want nothing to do with it this week. I don't even care if there's value. I'm not going anywhere near it.
Yeah, I want nothing to do with it either. You have Ryan Findlay, who literally had a 3.8 yards per attempt game last week, an absolute like potato in the pocket this guy is so far. And it's very similar to Miami in terms of just tank season, if not worse. Like Andy Dalton, there's no reason this guy shouldn't be starting. It's kind of embarrassing that they're running out Ryan Findlay even to Andy Dalton. So yeah, it's a spot where you have the number one overall defense, according to Pro Football Focus, going up against the number 30 or the 31st, second worst offense in the league right now. And it's probably the worst when you factor in more weeks of Ryan Findlay as a starting cornerback or quarterback. So it's not a situation where I want anything. Boyd's price point at $5,000 just seems appealing, but then you remember Ryan Findlay's a quarterback and it's a really difficult matchup. So nothing stands out. Joe Mixon against the top 5 run defense doesn't stand out at all to me. I think that the volume is still there on the ground for him to see 15 plus carries, probably relies on touchdowns, but the price point also came up on it. So approaching 6K in his price point in this type of a matchup as a huge underdog is probably not something I'll get to. Cincinnati just seems like a total wash this week.
What about Pittsburgh? We don't know if James Conner is going to play. If he does, on DraftKings, he's $8,000. If he doesn't, Jalen Samuels is $7,200. Of course, Mason Rudolph has done nothing to suggest that he's a viable fantasy quarterback. We've taken a guy in Juju Smith-Schuster who had been fantastic last season, took Antonio Brown out of the equation, and Juju's having an awful year. I don't think it really any fault of his own, but nevertheless, he's not going to play anyway this week. And dude, even the Pittsburgh side, it's really gross. Deontay Johnson's also questionable. Like, even if these guys are all out, are you? I guess James Washington would make for a reasonable play, but Sal, he's $5,000. It's not like you're getting a discount there either. This is gross. This whole game.
Yeah, it's all gross. We'll see what happens later in the week come Thursday, Friday practice reports. But I would imagine right now, James Conner, it seems like his shoulder wasn't as serious as they expected once he got hurt and re-injured that shoulder in the last game on prime time. But it doesn't seem like he has the greatest chance earlier in the week of suiting up and missing at least 1 week, but we'll see. He's at a high price point and a good matchup, surely, but again, dealing with an injury, and you probably still see some sort of committee behind him and not the same type of usage. So nothing stands out in the running backs. Like Jalen Samuels is priced up to $7,200. He's $3,200 more dollars than he was when he was a smash play. And even Trey Edmonds last week had 47% of the snaps compared to Samuels just 34. Samuels has done absolutely nothing on the ground. 45 carries for 115 yards this year. He's relying on volume, and at 7,200, if you don't get the 10 plus reception game out of him, he's pretty much washed. So I don't want that. Trey Edmonds is 3,900, but what are you going to get? 10 carries out of him, 10 total touches. So he might pay off that type of a tag if he gets in the end zone. Seems pretty thin. Washington at 5K, I actually think is an okay play because he played 85% of the snaps. As long as one of those receivers miss, he's sort of a price for what his role is going to be, but I think there's upside there.
How about Johnny Holton?
Yeah. No, well, if both of these guys are out, Johnny Holton at a cheaper price point becomes at least in play.
He saw 7 targets last week, 60% of snaps. You could be worse, but still.
Yeah, exactly. I think my favorite play is just going to be Vance Mcdonald. He's number 2 in routes run for a tight end over the past month, pretty much since he returned. He's still running a ton of routes. He's going to be getting a lot of short passes for a low A-dot quarterback in Mason Rudolph. I like Vance Mcdonald this week a lot more if, 1, James Conner is out, but then 2, you have one of those wide receivers and preferably Juju out in the short passing game. So I think we end up getting one of those receivers out, both in a concussion protocol. Seems unlikely they both play, probably get at least one out. So I think McDonald's the guy I like the most, followed by James Washington. The running backs, Jalen Samuels is just priced up now to a point where he doesn't seem appealing.
Yeah, I don't really see any way I get there. Like we just mentioned, Holton did see a lot of opportunities, but he hauled in 1 of 7 targets. And there's nothing to suggest that with Mason Rudolph here, that he's going to be anything different. So Holton going to be anything different than, like, I don't know, Trey Quinn, not even in the style of play, but just in the type of opportunities you're seeing with Mason Rudolph. That's what's gross to me. So I guess if you wanted to get there, you could, but that everyone would have to be out, including Deontay Johnson. Let's talk about Cleveland and Miami. So like I said, we got the 3 lowest total games are 1, 2, and 3 on our list today, coincidentally. And then you've got Miami and Cleveland. 44.5 total. The Cleveland Browns are 11-point favorites. Now, this game is very interesting to me for a couple of reasons, Sal. First off, Kareem Hunt clearly going to be involved a lot in the offense. Nick Chubb didn't see a single opportunity on 3rd down last game. Not one. He didn't see a single target or carry on 3rd down. They all went to Kareem Hunt if a running back was going to be involved. Now, Nick Chubb still saw a boatload of opportunities, 27 carries on the day. Wasn't effective with them against a good Pittsburgh defense, but still saw 27 carries in a game that they led throughout. Only one target, but 27 carries. Meanwhile, Kareem Hunt played a good amount of snaps. So he's going to be firm. He's going to be squarely, nested into this offense. I don't see any reason he wouldn't be. 55% of snaps, 72% for Chubb. So they were on the field together a decent amount. I still think Chubb, though, in a spot where we could once again see him get an easy 20-plus carries in a game where they're almost 2 touchdown favorites, is still viable, even with Kareem Hunt in the offense.
Yeah, I think he's still viable. It's very interesting, though. So I sent a tweet out earlier today because I was looking at the situation. You have Kareem Hunt running 7 more routes than Chubb the last 2 weeks, but don't let those numbers being close seem like it's close at all, because Hunt's caught 13 balls on 16 targets where Chubb's had 2 catches on 4 targets. He's obviously the last priority when he's running routes, Chubb, and Kareem Hunt's probably the number 1 or number 2 priority on the field. He's ran 11 of his routes, 24% out of the slot for Kareem Hunt. That's actually impacted Jarvis Landry's usage on this team, which is concerning moving forward. But for Kareem Hunt, I just look at him and I see a guy who only has 10 rush attempts the last 2 weeks. He right now, if this is the way they're going to deploy him, get him on the field a lot more, throw him in the slot about 5-6 times a game. It's kind of concerning because he's 5,600, which to me just screams out, is this just James White? Like, is this a guy who's going to have?
He's basically a wide receiver. Yeah, he is. He is. And the question, how much does that actually affect Chubb? Of course, Chubb in the passing game, it affects him, but it's not like Chubb was ever like, you're probably, what was he averaging on the season before Chubb in terms of targets? Like 3.5 per game or something?
Yeah, I have it right here. So Chubb was averaging per game, he was averaging 3.7 targets.
Okay. So you're probably losing, 2.7 targets, maybe 3. Point being, I don't necessarily see this a spot where Kareem Hunt is vulturing a ton of opportunities in the run game. And we did see that last week.
Yeah, so exactly. I still like Chubb here. I think just based on the amount of routes he's still running, 38, like he's no priority, but he's still definitely involved for like checkdowns for 1 or 2 a game. So I think Chubb's still fine. The price tag coming up in this matchup, it's a slate once again where you're probably going to have to pay up for 1 to not, if not 2 running backs, because there's just nothing below 5K that stands out. Really nothing that much below 6K that stands out on this slate to me. So you're just naturally going to be in that range. And yeah, Kareem Hunt, for me, yes, he's been good the last 2 weeks, but if he doesn't find the end zone at 5,600, it makes it really hard to believe he pays that tag off. He's pretty much a more expensive James White. And you're going to get, 6-7 targets. Maybe he ends up with like a 12-point day if he catches a couple of them, which pretty much means he's an overpriced slot wide receiver who has low ADOT targets. So if he's not going to carry the ball, it really hurts the upside of the price tag.
Yeah, and I'm not going to pretend that I'm enamored with Cleveland's offense, but Kareem Hunt has helped them. The big thing is, how many 3rd and long situations are you going to see against Miami? They led the Pittsburgh Steelers in that game, but the Steelers are still an excellent offense or an excellent defense in really all phases. Miami, you can't say the same for them. I think this could be a game where it's just controlled on the ground. So Nick Chubb's price tag doesn't make him a priority to me, but I think it's important to point out that it's not like he's splitting all of the carries with Kareem Hunt. And as we pointed out already, first of all, Nick Chubb had 3 red zone looks last game. Kareem Hunt was not featured in the red zone at all. 11-1 in terms of red zone looks over in the 2 games that Kareem Hunt has played. And while Kareem Hunt was involved, remember, Chubb still played 72% of the snaps. So it shouldn't be overblown or overstated at all here. Nick Chubb is still viable. Do you like Odell Beckham or Jarvis Landry here?
Yeah, so I like Odell Beckham here. The price point at 7K is higher than it has been as of late, but this is a guy who's had to face Chris Harris Jr. and Tre'Davious White, probably the 2 toughest outside of like a Ramsey and Stephon Gilmore, Marlon Humphrey type of guys. 2 of the top 5 cornerback matchups you could probably get in shadows. He did fine against he did fine against Chris Harris, but Tre'Davious White was definitely a tough matchup for him. Now he's going to have a much easier matchup. You're going to get Nick Needham, who was playing really well for Miami until last week. John Brown got him for 5 catches, 84 yards, and a touchdown in man coverage. So it's a good spot for Odell at a $7,000 price tag. I imagine his ownership still stays low. You're trusting Baker Mayfield here. They're 11-point favorites, so they don't have to rely on the pass that much. But even in a game where Mayfield throws 28, 30 times, you probably still see 7-8 targets for Odell. So I do like him, especially if it's lower ownership. I'm kind of shying away from Jarvis Landry. The price point's at a season high for him, and you might get David Njoku returning this week. He's eligible to return. We'll see if he practices. They said they have to see what his conditioning is like. But then also, this is a 2-week low for Jarvis Landry in slot routes. It's 41.9% over the last 2 weeks. That's no shocker because Kareem Hunt ran 24% of his routes out of the slot. So if you get Landry moving more towards the outside, facing one, better cornerbacks, but also two, not as many conversions on his catches and targets, it's just really tough to rely on that volume. Now, he's looked good all season, really. The past month has been spiking for him when Odell's been in tougher matchups. But I do have concerns if you still see Hunt in the slot, that Landry on the outside becomes more of a thing in this offense. And that definitely, I would imagine, hurts his overall upside, at least consistency-wise.
Okay. Miami side. By the way, the Dolphins just cut Mark Walton.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they just cut him, like, I don't know, we got the news 30 minutes ago or so. So you have that. You have Kalen Ballage. This dude just stinks, man. Like, he's really bad, Sal. 9 carries for 9 attempts last time out. The longest run he has this season is 8 yards. Just absolutely atrocious. He's basically dead last in every rushing category. Go on Pro Football Focus and check everything. He's pretty much dead last in everything. Outside of, I think, elusiveness, David Johnson is last, which is also pretty remarkable. But nevertheless, it's a spot where I know he's cheap, but like if Kalen Ballage didn't score last week, he was still disappointing. But that touchdown was enough to not absolutely ruin you because Brian Hill was chalky. But I'm not feeling it. This whole team right now is sketchy. Devontae Parker, like we said, Tre'Davious White slipped. He's had 10 targets in back-to-back games though, and certainly is involved. He's a big air yards guy, and I guess there's that, but he's also not cheap.
Yeah, he's not cheap. He's a guy that it's a matchup probably against Denzel Ward, who has only played about half the games this season due to injury, against good wide receivers, and you can judge where Devontae Parker falls in that list, probably around average. Against good wide receivers, Ward's been exposed, but he's given up pretty much 3 receptions and 40 yards a game, which is around average, if not a little bit worse for an individual player. So nice matchup for Parker if you want to go back to him. I'm not too thrilled. He's like a secondary option. Yeah, Kalen Ballage, terrible running back. 14 touches for 17 yards last week. And it was the weirdest game because he has 5 catches for 8 yards and falls in the end zone. So you're probably not going to get that type of production. You got like a ceiling game out of this guy, and he had 17 total yards.
Exactly.
Yeah, he had 17 total yards for a ceiling game. So I actually like this. I like that he did that last week because there's like, we're going to keep going through it. There's like no options, at least early in the week, in this 4-3 and 5K range at running back. So people are going to see that game log watch and just also know that he's playing 80% of the snaps. He's still the lead running back. Like, he'll probably be one of the chalkier running backs. I would imagine he was last week, like 20% owned. So if that happens again and people are going to rely on his like 1.1 yards per touch last week, then I'm all for 20% of the field getting to that. We'll know more on that probably tomorrow. So I'm kind of excited to see if he is highly owned because there's really no other options for starting running backs in that range.
Patrick Laird had 6 receptions on 6 targets. He was played the second most snaps behind Kalen Ballage at 23%. Look, you may end up seeing a situation where somebody like Patrick Laird actually comes in and gets 15. It's funny because we saw it with Mark Walton, right? Out of the blue. He just started getting work, but it's not something you can rely on. But yeah, 6 targets for Laird. And, he only played, this is what I find at least worth talking about and not spending a lot of time on. He only played 16 snaps, and he was targeted 6 times and had a carry. So he was on the field for 16 snaps and had 7 total looks. Not a bad ratio. It's just I have no idea if he's actually going to be involved at all going forward. But with how absolutely ineffective we've seen, Kalen Ballage, would it be a complete surprise for me to see Patrick Laird in there? No. He ran 11 routes on 16 snaps. So there is that. He is dirt cheap, but it's not fun at all.
Yeah, it's not fun at all. Like, and I think that, or at least logic tells you that, okay, they have to start to give somebody else the ball in the backfield. They're also the Dolphins and they don't care. So maybe they don't. So I don't know. At this point, it's really hard to tell, but Gaskin has had 1 carry over the last 2 weeks. I think Laird got 2. He has 2 carries over the last 2 weeks. So it's just not a spot that we can rely on it. If it comes out, if anything, it's probably just going to be out of the blue, like you said, with Walton, but really tough to play that with any sort of conviction. Really tough to recommend that outside of just taking a stab on it in some lineups. Probably just avoid the whole situation. But I am kind of happy that we probably get a spiked ownership in Ballage from, it just looks like a good game he had last week, and it was the complete opposite.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to go anywhere near Patrick Laird. What I'm saying, though, is I wouldn't be surprised if he ends up seeing like 15 looks in this game. It wouldn't shock me.
Yeah.
And the thing is, I don't worry about them tanking and not doing what they should be doing in terms of personnel adjustments. Here's why. They can try to win as much as they want. They're still going to lose. So, like, Steve Flores can still, or Brian Flores can still make adjustments. It doesn't mean it's going to work. So, I don't think you intentionally have to tank. If you know what I mean. So
Yeah, exactly. When you cut all your talent and trade it away, it's pretty easy to lose.
right. You don't actually have to tank on the field anymore. Just get rid of all your good players.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway, Atlanta and Tampa Bay, here we are. It only took 5 games for us to get to a decent one. Of course, I think we'll have something out of Cleveland and maybe a little bit out of a few of these games we've discussed already, but now we've got a pretty decent game here. 51 total. 51 over on their highest on the week overall. The Falcons are 4-point favorites. They get a 27.5 total, 23.5 for Tampa. I want to start with Tampa. I liked Winston with Marshawn Lattimore out. I thought this could be a much improved spot. Godwin and Evans in such a heavily concentrated offense. You know, what could go wrong? Well, I'll tell you what could go. Oh, and I liked Howard too, because in the 2 games that he had played, he went down with an injury. The game before that and the game since he returned, he was top 3 in routes run at the tight end position. So he was actually getting more involved. And then he tries to wrap the damn football around his back. Fumble, well, it turns into an interception. And did you see any more Howard after that? No, sir. Matter of fact, Cameron Brate ended up hauling in 10 of 14 targets in that game. And you, dude, it was so frustrating because then you saw, who was it? Scotty Miller, right? Scotty Miller had 6 targets, even some deep targets. I mean, it all went to shit, Sal. And a lot of that started with that O.J. Howard play that turned ugly. He played 25% of snaps. Cameron Brate played 75%. Now, O.J. Howard played 99% of snaps the game prior to that, 75% prior to that. You can't tell me that had nothing to do, fumble, call it what you want, had nothing to do with him being yanked off the field. And on the other side, about to turn it over to you, Atlanta, their secondary has improved enough to where what we've seen over the past 2 weeks is they're not giving the quarterback time to get a quick release. And Dan Quinn said the same thing. And the pass rush is getting there. They ranked dead last in sacks coming into that game against New Orleans 2 weeks back. They now have 11 sacks over their last 2 games. This defense is actually disruptive right now. So I think we at least have to look at them and take a different approach than we did earlier in the year, where it was just, okay, load up on whoever's playing the Atlanta Falcons. Floor's yours.
Yeah, I agree with that on the pass rush. I want to look more into it. If it's obviously there's adjustments made at the bye week since then, and maybe a little bit of the coach being on a hot seat spikes some of that. Kyle Allen last week holding onto the ball more than really anybody else in the league.
They moved they moved the assistant coach to the defensive line.
Okay, so there's actually a change,
which may have something to do with it, but Quinn, when asked, said and a couple of the corners said we're just finally executing. So maybe they're hiding something. I don't know, but it seems like one personnel move and then, as they said, execution. But I dug into it a lot. I couldn't find anything outside of them just being better and getting pressure by taking easy passes away from the quarterback and making him hold on to the ball longer.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, obviously the secondary part of it, and then the personnel would make sense. Yeah, I was looking for it too and couldn't find anything really in a 2-week sample, but I guess that makes more sense. Yeah, this is the game that stands out. The highest total on the week right now. I don't really care what happened last week all that much. I was on Howard as well. You see 14 targets for Brate. Howard, in my opinion, definitely was benched after that, just in terms of the usage. So I don't think you see that happen again. Who knows what we see out of Howard moving forward. It seems like they're kind of done with him, but I'm sure he'll be on the field. It's just a spot where coming into that week, only 2 Tampa Bay players outside of Evans and Godwin had more than 6 or more targets in a game, and he got 2 different ones in that game alone, in Scotty Miller and Cameron Brate. So it's kind of a weird one. Now you get still a good matchup. Atlanta defensive line has been good, but there's really nothing in their secondary. If you get still constant pressure, that will help your secondary, of course, force passes, but there's nothing in their secondary that scares me when you have Mike Evans against Isaiah Oliver, Chris Godwin, who will probably still be in the slot majority of the time, and they've been using Kendall Sheffield in the slot now. So positive matchups there. It's really tough to pick out, though, a cheaper option because last week it seemed like O.J. Howard for a stack, but that went to shit. So we don't really know where to go at this point. You kind of have to pay up. if you want to stack Winston. And once again, Winston has a fumble, doesn't lose it, but 4 interceptions, 2 not his fault. He still ends up with 22 fantasy points. So this guy's just going to continue to chuck the ball. It's the premier spot on the slate. A lot of people are probably going to know it, but once again, I'll have interest in both sides.
Yep. And just in case anyone's wondering, OJ Howard was benched. So that really sucked, man, because I had a decent amount. And look, I was underweight on Waller and underweight on all these very popular or very high-owned tight ends, because why not, right? It felt like the perfect week where the position sucks. So, hey, let me take a shot on a guy that's coming in at like 5% ownership in a game that has a 51 over-under. And he gets that target. I said, okay, they're getting him involved early on. And boom, you knew as soon as that happened, it was a wrap.
Yep. Yeah, and that's the worst feeling, too, when you just wait for it to see the next series out that he's not out there and then the one after that.
Oh, dude, you know what's even worse than that? Knowing that that's the case and that the tight end in his stead had 14 targets.
Yeah, I think I saw somewhere on Twitter somebody said that was a record for a Tampa Bay tight end, just rubbing it in the face of anybody the whole season for OJ Howard's year, really, but especially that week.
It was so painful.
Terrible.
So painful.
So terrible. But
go ahead.
I was just going to say on the other side of this, it's the same thing. I mean, Julio's in a smash spot. He's probably my favorite wide receiver on the entire week as of right now, just Tuesday. So a lot to go through to figure out if there's anything else to get to. Ridley coming off of one of the better games in his career, best game on the season for him. He'll also have a beneficial matchup. I mean, you're going up against guys on the outside and probably Carlton Davis, Mike Edwards for in the slot against Gage. So all these pass catchers stand out again. I'm probably going to be like the Russell Gage #1 fan club holder, but I'm going to go back to Russell Gage this week, still below 4K. And look, the guy's running a ton of routes. He has, over the last couple of weeks, the third, obviously behind the 2 guys on the outside, but he was coming into last week with 68 routes run. That only increased last week, but they've been out ahead, and Vegas hasn't predicted it, but they've been out ahead the last 2 games by a lot. So instead of getting like a 7 or 8 target game from the slot from Gage, you're getting 5 targets. Last week had a touchdown called back, which, I mean, it should have been an easy catch, just drops it going to the ground. So I think there's upside there based on the price point. I'm not really a tournament break or slate break or anything, but at 3,900, you get 15 out of a guy. It goes a long way.
For sure. And I want to be very clear about something. While I'm confident that Atlanta has improved their defense enough to where they're not just like the worst in the league, right?
Yeah.
At least they're secondary. And, the run defense was never atrocious. So if you just improved a little bit, things could turn around. With that in mind, Chris Godwin played 100% of snaps last week. Like Mike Evans played 96%. These guys are on the field the whole game. And the run game, we saw it. One hit wonder. Ronald Jones went back to seeing 4 carries last week. They're going to pepper these guys with targets. I still love this spot. Jameis Winston, as you mentioned, like this isn't Kyle Allen. If Jameis Winston has 4 picks, he and Kyle Allen both did last week, so it's a good comparison. One of them is going to finish with 7 fantasy points, and the other is still going to throw for 313 yards and 2 touchdowns. He has one of the highest floors in the league at the position.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know where this guy will be next year. You don't get a much better offense around you talent-wise than this Tampa Bay one with their receivers and even tight ends. So it's like fixing your mistakes is probably something you should have done going into this year. But yeah, fantasy-wise, I think there has to be some sweet spot of if Jameis has a 2 interception game, you pray for it because it's probably like a 30-point fantasy day out of him. And at the worst, he'll probably finish with 20 like he has been doing when he throws for 4 picks. So I'm not really worried about the turnovers there. And just the exact numbers on a guy like Gage, 90 routes run over the 3 games since filling in for Sanu. And that's in games where they've led by multiple scores, 3 scores in the last 2 games. And you don't expect that. He has 6 targets a game and he's had 13 receptions. So if you get a little more passing volume from Matt Ryan, which you haven't had because of these big leads, you're probably seeing somewhere in the average of a 7 target game from a guy out of the slot at 3,900. It seems decent.
What about, you talked Julio Jones. I agree. We don't even need to spend a ton of time on him. On Thursday, you and I will go game by game, break everything down even more comprehensively. Brian Hill, just utterly disappointing, but not the biggest surprise either. 15 carries, 30 yards. Now he faces a actual really good run defense as opposed to Carolina. Things couldn't have played out any better for Brian Hill last game, honestly. They were playing with a huge lead the entire game. He played 60% of snaps, had 15 carries. He was targeted 3 times, got nothing done. Of course, they had a touchdown call back on an offensive holding, but man, just a bad performance. Now you've got him going up against the Tampa D that clearly funnels everything through the air. I'll pass.
Yeah, no interest at all in Brian Hill this week. I think even did the price point come up on him too? The price point is at 4,900, so the price point even comes up on him barely. But yeah, not a spot that I want to get to Brian Hill. Probably don't get there. It's really just a passing game here overall, and you just rank it as many people probably would imagine. Julio Ridley and Russell Gage for me there. It seems like the side that's I don't know. It seems a little bit easier to stack this side because obviously Tampa's receivers are both expensive. Matt Ryan in his own right is more expensive, but quietly having a very good year, obviously aided by at least the first 8 weeks, 9 weeks of the year, bad defense. So I probably like stacking the Atlanta side a little bit more here. I think that the worst defense is definitely, especially with the emergence of this pass rush for Atlanta, is definitely Tampa Bay, and it's just easier to run it back with on that side.
Do you have now? Calvin Ridley was a great play last week, who flew under the radar. Not if you were watching Awesemo shows, though. I'll tell you that much. We were there because Julio Jones going up against the guy in Bradbury who has limited him every time almost they've faced. Now you have a spot where, of course, you've got some injuries to this offense. Austin Hooper wouldn't be practicing tomorrow or won't be practicing tomorrow, so I don't know what we're going to see. We already know Quinn already said that he won't be, but I think it's still a fine spot for Ridley, but in a game where you're not worried about who's covering Julio Jones, it's not as appealing.
Yeah, exactly. And you have the Ridley price point coming up to mid 6K range where he's right there at the same price tag as Allen Robinson, who definitely not as good of a quarterback or by his side, but still the number one option in his offense. So you have to start making decisions there. So yeah, it's definitely probably like a Julio. And I went to it last week in spots and got burned by Ridley being the one to go off, but Julio and Gage types of stacks, I think have upside there just based on the fact that Ridley's price point is what, $1,000 more than last week.
Yeah. New Orleans, Carolina, a couple good games here. This one, 47 over under. Saints 8.5-point favorites at home. Nice bounce back win last week after that home loss to the Falcons. You got Michael Thomas, whose price has actually come down, but I tell you, like Michael Thomas is he's gonna get his at least, no matter who he's facing. I think we would all agree that is generally the case with Michael Thomas. When you talk about a concentrated offense, there's no question that Michael Thomas is one of only a couple guys here that's going to get looks week in and week out. But he's going to get the Bradbury treatment. And, I have so much respect for Bradbury. He's another guy, has not allowed a touchdown in coverage all season long. One of the bottom 5 passer ratings allowed this year, anyone with at least 100 coverage snaps. It's a tough spot for him, which I think makes this a very interesting overall dynamic for the New Orleans offense.
Yeah, I think it does. It obviously makes it a little bit more difficult to trust Thomas. Just the routes that he run makes it a little easier, even whatever the matchup might be for him, just pulling up what he's done. So far this year, you're getting around 30% of Michael Thomas's routes run out of the slot, which helps him for sure if he's going to get away from Bradbury. Scheme-wise, you would imagine that a guy like Sean Payton just moves Thomas into the slot a little bit above that, maybe get him in there 40% of the time, every 2 out of 5 snaps or so. But yeah, it's another nice and appealing spot. Carolina's secondary all year has been pretty locked down outside of really Calvin Ridley getting behind Dante Jackson and really working Dante Jackson, one of the first guys to do that all year on the right side of the field last week, Atlanta versus Carolina. So it's a spot where New Orleans has Kamara, who I think is actually favorably priced if you can just rely on that passing game to stay the way that it is. Obviously, there's still a split seems to be going on with Murray and him in the backfield. But I think that on New Orleans, at least this week, early in the week, can change come Thursday. But Kamara stands out as sort of the priority here. Michael Thomas at 9,300, tougher matchup. And if you want to pay all the way up for him, it's fine. It's just another spot where there is opportunity cost of doing that yet again when he's $2,000 more expensive than other players who have very similar upside. I mean, we saw last week, we mentioned that he scores 28 to 30. That's a good week for him, but at his price tag, it doesn't make him needed. And you saw multiple wide receivers, John Brown, guys who are even cheaper than that, go for 25 to 30 plus. And when that happens, it's just really hard that the guy in the 9K plus range is needed.
For sure. You look at it, Bradbury hasn't traveled into the slot at all this year, but I also think it's important to look at who he's faced. Tampa Bay twice, so you've got Mike Evans outside. The Rams actually have quality outside receivers. That was week 1. DeAndre Hopkins in Houston. He limited Hopkins to basically nothing. Then teams like Jacksonville, San Francisco, Tennessee, then Green Bay. He was out of that game. And then Atlanta, Julio Jones. So my question is, he hasn't seen anything like this yet this season where your clear top wide receiver, your clear top player is going to run a decent amount of his routes out of the slot. Not all of them, but 29%. I don't think it's crazy to assume that Bradbury just follows him, because wouldn't it seem odd to put anyone else on him when Ted Ginn and Traquan Smith are your alternative options on the outside?
Yeah, exactly. It would seem odd, and I don't know exactly what they'll do here. They had last week Cockrell, he was out, and he's been sort of a slot cornerback for them, so that would make it even more reason if he was to miss again to put Bradbury into the slot. The only somewhat comparable, and it's not even as comparable as I would think, was DJ Shark in week 5. He had a really nice game, but he wasn't shadowed by Bradbury. Bradbury was on him for about 30 to 40% of the game. Shark went off against Dante Jackson, and just actually, it was Dante Jackson was out that week. It was a mixture of rotating backup cornerbacks like Cockrell, but you had DJ Shark that week running about 25% of his snaps out of the slot, and you didn't see Bradbury follow him. Again, a much different receiver with Mike Evans, and also Bradbury wasn't shadowing him to begin with. So that's like the smallest thing you could piece from, but even then it's not a full picture of what can happen here. So, I mean, logic says, yeah, Bradbury should go into the slot. A lot of these outside guys just don't trust their skill set in the slot, so they won't go there. But as good as he's been, I would imagine that he at least follows sometimes. We've seen it with Chris Harris. He followed Allen Robinson and Devontae Adams into the slot this year. That's the only time he's gone into the slot.
Yeah. And we've seen Marlon Humphrey follow whoever he needs to into the slot. A lot of games against top slot receivers. So, yeah, I don't know. Alvin Kamara, though, this does feel like a smash spot for him. His price has come up, understandable. But the Carolina Panthers will funnel the defense to the run. And I think, they're not going to be unstoppable. But Bradbury really is one of the best here. Like you said, Cockrell, we'll see what's going on with him. But ultimately, I look at New Orleans, and to some extent, my concerns were somewhat true in that Kamara is going to get all of the work, almost all the work in the passing game, but they're still seeing somewhat of a split in the run game. He saw 13 carries to Latavius Murray's 10 last week in a game that they had a pretty comfortable lead. And as far as snap counts go, Latavius Murray still saw 41% to 61% for Kamara. That's down from 78% Kamara and 25% Latavius Murray last week, when literally they were just throwing to Kamara on every play late in the second half because they were playing from behind. So I still expect him to get like the clear majority of work, but it does appear as though Latavius Murray is taking on the Mark Ingram role, maybe even a little bit more, but he's still going to see 10, 11, 12 carries in a game where they're comfortably leading.
Yeah, and this is something that from the beginning of the year they were saying would happen. Sean Payton was saying that Kamara is not going to just be an 80% type of guy. And we saw it to an extent this year. Like, he had 13 carries last week. I think if you get 16 out of Kamara in a week on the ground, that's probably a good week for him, on average somewhere around 15. So, yeah, I was fine with the usage last week. Obviously, the passing game role helped a lot in that one. And I think that's something that's going to continue. They just have nothing out here. Like, Traquan Smith, 2 games back now from running a ton of routes. He didn't catch anything in the last game. Ted Ginn catches a short touchdown pass aided by a penalty. So it's just a week where they have no other weapons. Jared Cook catches a nice touchdown in the back of the end zone, but he didn't see a lot of volume. It's clearly Michael Thomas and Kamara, as it usually is. And this week, when you just look at running backs, there's some question marks around Nick Chubb. Really good matchup against Miami, but his passing game role, like we touched on earlier, might be gone. And you have that passing game role and the versatility of Kamara. Lots of question marks around Sakharam Barkley, his health, his role in this offense, and just everything, the matchup as well on the road as an underdog. It's a spot where if you're paying up, I mean, I think CMC we're about to talk about is on a tier of his own and also a price point of his own. But then Kamara just stands out to me as like the next best option when paying up above 8,000 or even above 7,500.
All right, let's do it. Talking Carolina side of the ball, Christian McCaffrey. Dude, he didn't score last week and still had 33 fantasy points. He's unstoppable.
Yeah, he's unstoppable. And the other thing was, like, I rostered him the heaviest I've rostered him all year because of just the matchup against Atlanta. And I think they're a little bit skewed for how they don't allow catches to running backs. And that's exactly what we've seen now, them facing Kamara, David Johnson, and McCaffrey. And they have to face Kamara and McCaffrey again this year. So load up there as well. But the price point doesn't change for a guy who has been in really back-to-back weeks of drawing like unlucky. Against the Packers, he should have had like a 3-yard touchdown catch, but it was underthrown by Kyle Allen. Last week, his team just gets down huge in a spot you don't expect. Like, when you're trailing by 3 scores the whole game, and you're still able, and you only have 14 carries, and you're still able to get to 25 touches, over 100 yards in the receiving game, it's just a spot, and he doesn't score, right? So it's just a spot where the price point doesn't move. He should be 11K probably, and I'd still like him. It's just another spot on the ground where I don't need him to get you there on the ground. Even in a tough matchup, I trust McCaffrey to have a efficient day on the ground, honestly, but he has that passing game role that's so elite, and it seems like Kyle Allen is, DJ Moore's out there for sure, but Christian McCaffrey seems to be his number one target all the time. And it makes sense when Kyle Allen's a little bit happy feet in the pocket. So yeah, McCaffrey, once again, he's on a tier of his own. He is the, in my opinion, best running back play on the slate. It's interesting this week where last week you can shove in what seemed like value in Brian Hill, maybe Miles Sanders, who I was high on and just gets 4 touches in the second half, does nothing. This week, it doesn't seem like there's that sort of value. So you probably have to find it elsewhere, if at all.
I'm loving what I've seen from DJ Moore this season. He was targeted in the end zone a couple times last game. He still can't get it done. It's not his fault either. He's working with Kyle Allen at quarterback. It's tough, but he's on the field for basically every single play. The big thing here, though, is does Marshawn Lattimore return and bolster this defense? And are you looking towards the passing game for Carolina?
So, yeah, if Marshawn Lattimore returns, I'd imagine he'd be on DJ Moore, which is very scary. Lattimore's been very good this year. And also, like, week 1 against DeAndre Hopkins, Hopkins scored on him, had like 50 yards, but Hopkins, like, a mammoth 150-yard 2-touchdown day was not all against Lattimore. I mean, the far majority of it wasn't, so he got a bad rap for that, but he's been very good since then. The only guy really to shut down Amari Cooper this year when Cooper was healthy. He's looked good. He goose-egged Mike Evans, of course. So if you have an increased price point on DJ Moore, I don't think it's too high still. I think it's probably appropriate right now, if not maybe a couple $100 too low. So I'm fine getting to Moore if there's no Marshawn Lattimore. We saw PJ Williams move to the outside last week. That's probably who you get DJ Moore on, and that's a good matchup if Lattimore does return, and we haven't had too much news on practicing yet on Tuesday here. So I don't probably get there. And yeah, I think Curtis Samuel is probably the most overrated, like, preseason hype guy. We had like Samuel and Chris Carson was another one, but he actually worked out so far this year. Samuel is just at a price point where he's 5,400. He's probably overpriced for what his role is. He relies on touchdowns at this point. He's sort of a big play upside guy. I mean, on paper, he seems to be that way, but with Kyle Allen out there, it's very much so. I'm going to throw it to McCaffrey. I'm going to throw it to DJ Moore, and then I'm going to throw it to Olsen sometimes. And Curtis Samuel seems to be the guy on low volume that relies on touchdowns. And I honestly just don't want it right now.
Yeah, I have no interest in it. It's McCaffrey and then DJ Moore for me. Pending Lattimore news, and I'll continue to do that each week. Even at these price points, I think it's perfectly reasonable. 5 to go here, Sal. And by the way, in case you haven't checked out awesemo.com yet, go ahead and do so at awesemo.com/join and use the sign-up code NFL Strategy, all one word, to get 50% off your first month of Awesemo Plus membership. If you scroll to the bottom of awesemo.com/join, you'll see video tutorials on all of our most popular and best tools. And of course, we cater the subscription to you, what type of player you are, whether you're a hobbyist or playing professionally or trying to. We want to make sure that you get everything you need at awesemo.com. Use that sign-up code NFL Strategy when you do. It'll get you 50% off your first month of Awesemo Plus subscription. Go to awesemo.com/join to check that out. Washington, Detroit, another barn burner here. I think there might be a piece or two that we can pull from it, but not a game that I think we're going to spend a ton of time on. This game has a 42.5 total. The Lions are 3.5-point favorites on the road. Jeff Driscoll's actually looked all right, Sal. I don't have any issue with what I've seen from him. He's done a decent job of protecting the ball. Hasn't fumbled. He threw 1 pick, but that's against Chicago. 3 touchdowns over this 2-game span. Pretty conservative, of course, but he's made some plays. And then you've got Bo Scarborough, who came out as the lead back last week out of nowhere, scored, had 14 carries for 55 yards, and led all Lions running backs in snaps. So some interesting developments in Detroit.
Yeah, I think Driscoll's nice, and I think that his just mobility, 88 rushing yards over the first 2 games, gets in the end zone last week. His ability to just produce on his own, keep drives alive because of his legs, but also, avoid sacks and just also have upside on that regard, extend plays. I think he's actually fine as like a lower end cash play just because of the price point. It's tough to really want to get to him as like a naked quarterback or anything when it comes down to rostering him in GPPs, but in cash, he stands out as a guy who's cheap in a really good matchup against a bottom 10 pass rush. So the mobility of a 25, 30 plus yard rushing game should be there once again. And he's the guy who stands out, but the rest of this team, not so much. I mean, if you get Kenny Golladay, price coming down at lower ownership, I think it's okay. But Driscoll under center, he's spreading the ball around through 2 games. You obviously don't have the same upside with Matthew Stafford for both pass attempts in a game, but also just the actual consistency behind his passing and the skill set there with Driscoll. So Golladay, if he's like 2% owned again and the price point coming down, coming off of a bad game, I can see getting like 4 or 5% in a big GPP, but it's nothing I'm convicted by. Marvin Jones was a guy who relied on 2 touchdowns last week, but he has seen very little volume, about 5 targets per week with Driscoll. He's just been lucky enough to catch 1 deep ball 2 weeks ago and 2 short touchdowns last week. So no interest in Jones as his price point stabilizes and even comes up $200 since last week, probably because of the touchdown. So you're going to get Marvin Jones probably on with Quentin Dunbar on him, which is a brutal matchup. Kenny Golladay should get the better matchup based on where they line up with Josh Norman. So if anything, alone, Kenny Golladay stands out. Yeah, Bo Scarborough, 49% of the snaps. It was almost double. Well, it was more than double what McKissick got. It was almost double what you saw out of Ty Johnson. So it's just interesting. He actually got tackled at the 1 yard line. He would have had 2 touchdowns in this game. He was really close. So it's interesting to see how this develops. He didn't practice all week out of nowhere. He's just active and does this. Like if I didn't even see him being listed as active, but if I even saw that, I would be like, okay, this guy's going to get like 5 to 10% of the snaps. Ends up leading the backfield, 15 touches. So yeah, it's not something I have conviction around, like where these price points are. If Scarborough becomes popular, you're probably looking at last week. Maybe he builds off of it and sees 60% of the snaps, but I'd say last week at like 40 to 50% is more realistic. And at that point, he's just probably like much worse, at least on paper, usage wise, what Brian Hill was. So it'll depend on where ownership is. But if these guys are going to split 100% of the snaps 3 different ways, it's really tough to rely on that.
Yeah. This game in general doesn't do a whole lot for me at all. You've got a good young player in Terry McLaurin. He's going to see Darius Slay. We saw what Darius Slay did last week to Amari Cooper. It opened things up quite a bit for Gallup and Randall Cobb. The problem is, who else are you going to go to outside of McLaurin in this offense? Darius Geis is back. Adrian Peterson still appears to not have a stranglehold, but certainly going to be involved. Like, this Washington offense to me is a no-go, just like the Bengals.
Yeah, it's a no-go. Paul Richardson missed last week, and you had Kelvin Harmon, another rookie who was drafted, I believe, after Terry McLaurin, if I remember correctly. He had 5 targets, or caught 5 balls and 6 targets, 53 yards. So he would be like the guy that would be freed up with Slay on McLaurin, but you're not really trusting that with Dwayne Haskins. A 3-headed backfield, even if Chris Thompson does return, he'll probably take on what Wendell Smallwood has been kind of portraying as the Chris Thompson role. And then you get Geis, who had a 35-yard touchdown. The thing that I liked about Geis was in season long, maybe worth a stash just for the rest of the season, if anything happens to AP or they just shut him down because he's old or he gets injured, whatever it might be, because he showed burst to get to the outside. That was a big concern for me, is he even healthy enough? And he beat every defender around him, got to the outside and just flew past them. But for fantasy DFS, for a 1 week thing, it's not a spot where I trust his 25 to 30% of the snaps to be anything. And I don't know if you saw Dwayne Haskins' conversation with his offensive lineman on Twitter. There's a video of Dwayne Haskins talking to his whole offensive line, like yelling at them, saying, "What do you want me to do to help you guys out?" And they're all just like ignoring him. It's like a brutal thing to watch. Like, I actually feel bad for Dwayne Haskins.
That's really unfortunate if that's not just how it appears to be and is actually the case.
Like Donald Penn was, or is it Penn? I forgot who it is. He was like the only one talking to him, and the other guys, like there was one guy like rolling his eyes, and he was like, I actually watching it, like I felt bad because he was like, "What do you want me to do? I'm trying to figure it out." And like they were just like sitting there like all lost, and one guy was just like not caring.
Yeah, I don't like to see that. I mean, the dude hasn't played well, but that's tough. But I just still have no interest. I feel bad for him, but doesn't mean I'm going anywhere near him this week. So let's talk about the Jets in Oakland. We got 4 games to go. A couple decent ones here. A couple that we're also gonna probably get through very quickly, and then close this one out. The New York Jets and the Oakland Raiders. Sam Darnold over the last 2 games. Now, let's be clear. He's had 2 cupcake matchups, one against Washington, one against the Giants. They've won both of them. They've scored 34 points in both. I think they may have had a defensive touchdown this past week, but it is at least interesting to see that, Sam Darnold has looked semi-competent the past 2 weeks. 5 touchdown passes. It's not terrible, and he's finally getting the ball to his receivers. Robbie Anderson, it's still disappointing, but Crowder saw another 8 targets, 76 yards, and a touchdown. Robbie Anderson got in the end zone, but he had only 3 targets, and that 1 reception went for 6 yards. And then Demaryius Thomas, who did play, 4 for 5 for 44. Like, it wasn't a huge game for any receivers. It was mostly Ryan Griffin that caught all 5 of his targets for 109 and a score. But Sam Darnold was better in this one, and his average depth of target here was 8th highest in the league last week, so it was in the top half at least of the league. Nothing really super encouraging, But can he repeat this against an Oakland team that defensively has really struggled in coverage this season and is one of the lesser talented teams in the secondary?
Yeah, exactly. Like I like this matchup individually for Sam Darnold, like season long stuff. It makes sense as a waiver or something like that. But when I start to break down into the reasons of playing him, like a lower end cash play, sure, but playing him in a tournament, Robbie Anderson hasn't been anything great. He'll have a fine matchup this week, but he just is failing to get separation. Crowder's price point, although he's been his most trusted target, it seems right there with Ryan Griffin. Crowder's price point is now 6,200. So you're literally paying for this guy to catch a touchdown because he sees 7 air yards per target. So he's like Crowder is very much so like I think he's a much better route runner, honestly, than like a Danny Amendola, but he survives on the same type of targets and receptions. He just is getting in the end zone 3 straight weeks. So it's a price point that's a little bit inflated by touchdowns, which is probably a jump off of that train type of spot. And I was saying the same thing last week. He gets in the end zone again. It's just how much can this keep up? The second he doesn't score a touchdown, he's useless probably for you at that price tag. So it's tough to want to get to the pieces. I think Ryan Griffin, albeit he caught like all 5 of his targets for 109 yards earlier in the season when he had a big game, he only had 4 targets. He caught 2 for touchdowns. So it's very low volume you're going to rely on. And again, he's another guy who's relying on touchdowns here, but it's a tight end position where you don't really have a lot of great options this week. So I think Darnold is fine as like a lower end cash option. I just don't like his playmakers. Maybe this is finally the week that Robbie Anderson gets going for the first time in like 7 weeks, but not much stands out. I think Bell is my favorite thing here from the Jets.
Man, it's ugly. Only because you don't really know who's going to get the opportunities. Jamison Crowder, sure, but that price is above 6K. I have trouble getting there. And pretty much echo your sentiment on everybody else. Could Robbie Anderson be the tournament play this year? Sure. Or this week? Yeah, it's possible, but he's let us down a lot in the past. And then Ryan Griffin's price has come up above that 4K mark. I think you could take some shots on Darnold in tournaments, but only if he's not popular. And we don't have ownership yet. So I guess we'll see. What about the other side? Josh Jacobs, he did exactly what we expected him to do in terms of opportunities, right? He saw 23 carries and 3 targets, caught all of them. That's what we expected. He just didn't get into the end zone. Do you have any interest in the Oakland Raiders this week?
Yeah, so Jacobs comes in at a price point that is definitely interesting at 7,400. I mean, you have a $1,000 cheaper Le'Veon Bell, who will probably see similar work to him overall in touches, just more receptions and maybe a better matchup. So Jacobs, just a 3-point favorite is nice, but a much more difficult matchup, even though the Jets still are without CJ Mosley for, I mean, maybe the year, probably 2 to 3 more weeks at least. It's still a tough matchup for Jacobs. And yeah, he'll continue to catch like 2 or 3 check down passes, but he's a guy who's very touchdown dependent because he won't have those 5 or 6 reception games for 40 yards, and then you don't need to rely on the touchdown. So the price point now up yet again. I think it's fine if you want to get there. He's just nowhere near a priority as he was last week. And I prefer other guys in his price range. Leonard Fournette, $100 cheaper. Bell, I touched on $1,000 cheaper. So not much here outside of, once again, like Darren Waller. He had a touchdown, I believe, last week, dropped in the end zone. So he would have had a better week than expected. But other than that, I mean, he's still seeing targets. He's still probably now getting closer to being appropriately priced at 5,700. It's a week, once again, like last week, if not worse now, where because of Evan Ingram's question marks, if you're not paying for Ertz or Waller, and Ertz price point is up there, although probably appropriate, you're punting again. So I think Waller stands out as a clear option. Tyrell Williams continues to rely on low volume, so you need big plays out of him. It's really Waller and then Jacobs from this team, as it usually is, and I'm not convicted around any of them.
Okay. Yeah, me neither. And Waller continues to be very high owned, but I'd rather just get to some cheaper options here. It's not to say that he's not going to have some solid games, but he's not the same guy that he was earlier this season. Well, he's not getting the same type of involvement. And having Tyrell Williams back, which we've seen over the past couple of weeks, gives them another option. Another big thing, too, is that we're actually seeing Hunter Renfrow be used a lot more, too. Right? Because earlier in the year, he was used sparingly, and now you've seen like almost 20 targets over the last 3 weeks. I think Waller's fine, but at that price, I don't see myself getting there with any frequency. Philadelphia and Seattle. Talk about this one, Sal. The Eagles are just absolutely decimated with injuries, and it's ugly. I don't know if Jordan Howard or Alshon Jeffrey play. That's yet to be seen, so we'll cover this more in depth, of course, on Thursday. But just taking a foundational look at it, you've got a 48-point total or over under. The Eagles are actually 2-point favorites here. Some of that may have to do with that whole west to east travel for the Seattle Seahawks, but I was certainly surprised to see that.
Yeah, I was surprised to see that as well. Obviously definitely because they're home, but I looked at that a couple of times to make sure I didn't have it backwards the way that it was like pulling over my sheets as a 2-point favorite. Seattle only 23 implied points. So we'll see what that means. And I think a big deal is definitely the travel and just where they're coming in from. But yeah, it's really tough to like a lot from Philadelphia. Still question marks around Jordan Howard. Is there any news? Did you see any updates? Is it more of a longer term thing on Jordan Howard? Is this a 1 week thing? We don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, he came into this as questionable throughout the week. And he practiced in a limited capacity throughout the entirety of the week. So I can't imagine it's anything super serious.
Yeah. Okay. So we'll see what happens there. Obviously, that'll change some things with if Miles Sanders becomes a value again, and we'll see. But yeah, from Philadelphia, I mean, the thing that stands out the most is I would like to get to Wentz in this spot. I don't trust anything besides his 2 tight ends. Like they ran absolutely, and I have the snap counts here for the league. They ran, which they usually do, and they led the league last year in 2 tight end sets, but just out of necessity, they had to run 2 tight end sets at a clip of 89% on the field was Ertz, 81% was Goddard. They only ran their third wide receiver, Arcega-Whiteside, ran 25% of the snaps. They pushed Matt Collins pretty much out of the rotation around 10 to 15%. So they were just running 2 tight ends as they have been doing, but to a much greater extent with no Alshon out there or Jordan Howard. So, and obviously no Deshaun Jackson. So you get Goddard and Ertz as like just the prime pass catchers in this offense. It's really hard to build a stack around that. I think Ertz at 6K is fine, even in difficult matchups. He keeps proving to be a guy who can beat double teams, and not only that, just bring in receptions and PPR formats to get you there at a weak tight end spot. But again, you're paying for the tight end then when you can punt for other guys who will probably score similar to him. So definitely the highest ceiling at tight end. It's really just Ertz, and if you want to punt tight end, Goddard. If Jordan Howard misses, I'll be happy to go back to Miles Sanders here. Just hopefully he gets more usage this week. I think 4 touches in the second half last week is rough to see.
It's really rough. I just have no interest here. I can't do it. I can't. What here? I don't care if they're 2-point favorites or if they have a 25-point implied total. There's just nothing here. The wide receivers have like a combined 75 yards over the last 2 games. It's ugly, and I don't see any point to try and get to it. What about Seattle, though? I do want to point something out. Since Jayla Mills returned, he has actually played really well, allowing one of the lowest passer ratings in the league. It may be like bottom 5 for anyone with at least 100 coverage snaps. And Avonte Maddox has played a lot better over the last 2 weeks. Ronald Darby, you can't say the same about him, but they have made some improvements now that they've gotten healthy. That secondary isn't nearly as bad as it was before.
Yeah, not nearly as bad. And yeah, I'm pulling up right now. When did Darby return? Week or Mills return week 8, I believe, or was it 7? Yeah. So
I think it was week 9, wasn't it? It was after the Cowboys game, I think. Maybe it was the Cowboys game.
Yeah, it was the Cowboys game because I remember he was on Amari and he actually played him well, but Amari had like 2 really nice catches. So yeah, since then, right now, Jayla Mills has a 42 passer rating against, which is obviously very good. He's given up, if I pull it back to the Cowboys game here, Jayla Mills, since returning, has given up 11 catches for 111 yards on 141 coverage snaps, a 43.9 just passer rating against. So yeah, he's looked really good. And during that same exact time, you actually have Sidney Jones playing really well in limited snaps. Of course, you have Ronald Darby playing the best that he's played in a 5-week sample. So, I mean, you saw it last week. Brady, sure, maybe not the greatest as he has been now and looking pretty bad, but this secondary over the last 2 or 3 weeks is very much improved. Not the same, just torch them, similar to Tampa Bay and maybe Atlanta to an extent. So it's a tougher matchup for sure. It seems like Tyler Lockett avoided a scary injury and he seems to be good to go, but we'll track that. There has yet to be a practice for him, but all the sentiment out of beat writers of Seattle is that he should be good to go for this game. If that's the case, you have a top dollar with only a 23 total, which seems a little bit odd. Russell Wilson. I think I prefer guys like Winston for $600 cheaper. Matt Ryan, sort of a coin flip for me right now at this point. But Wilson, he has nice options still, although the Eagles secondary has improved. It's not something that scares me away from the Locketts and the DK Metcalfs. Jacob Hollister has been good for Seattle, but you might get Ed Dixon back this week, which should cut into that. It's a spot where I'm not really convicted around paying top dollar for Wilson right now. I think it's fine to get to, but I'm not sure he's the priority next to Matt Ryan and Jameis in similar spots. They don't have the mobility, although Jameis somewhat does. Not the same upside maybe on a whole season basis, but for this 1 week, when you take into account salaries, I'm not sure Wilson's a priority as a number 1 option. He'll probably be like a top 3 or 4 guy that I get to and break down more later in the week.
I really thought early on, like if I looked at this game on a schedule, I'd say I love this spot for Wilson. But I do think that the Eagles defense has played better. I mean, again, they held Tom Brady and the Patriots. Of course, it's one game to 17 points. But if you just watch them, they have looked a lot better. The coverage is a lot tighter. There have been some in the middle of the field that have gotten away from them. But overall, it's a tougher spot for me. Do you want to touch on anything else from this game?
No, just that. Yeah, the expectation is that he's going to be ready to play for Lockett. And then I think that Jacob Hollister is an interesting tight end play, but it's probably going to go under the radar, the impact that Ed Dixon would have on his snap counts, who is scheduled to make a return here for like the second time this year, dealing with a lot of injuries. So I would keep an eye on those. Nothing really stands out, even though it's a lot of these guys are priced up. Just the team total doesn't match it at 23.
Yeah, I would also say, for what it's worth, that Chris Carson just gets such a heavy workload that if he's going to be, super low owned, I'm never going to argue with playing, $6,700 Carson in a game where he could easily see another 25 carries. It's just, it's not a good matchup. It's not a particularly good matchup, but he's so heavily involved and just has a stranglehold on the backfield that I think you could do worse. Jacksonville and Tennessee. Talking about two other guys with a stranglehold in their respective backfields, Leonard Fournette being one of them, and Derrick Henry being the other. Does this game do anything for you? I guess I can throw the numbers at you, but to me right now, I think we're going to be able to pull one or two things from it. But when you start measuring them up, some of these players against other guys that are similarly priced on this slate, it starts to get a little bit underwhelming.
Yeah, it does. I mean, you get DJ Shark explodes last week. Now this week, he's going to have a more difficult matchup against Adore Jackson. Fine to get back to him if you want. It's just not a priority. D.D. Westbrook came out and played over 80% of the snaps in the slot, but he'll have Logan Ryan, who earlier this season shut him down. So it's just not a good matchup for him. The thing that stands out the most is obviously Leonard Fournette and his volume, similar to what you get out of Carson, just in probably a better matchup. Although a tough matchup, if you're going to keep getting Leonard Fournette's bad games where he catches 5 balls, it's enough that if he gets in the end zone, it's fine. So I still have just middling interest in Fournette in that upper tier range from Jacksonville. And then honestly, from the passing game, the thing that stands out the most with not a lot of volume or confidence behind it, but it is probably Chris Conley. He gets to go up against LaShawn Sims in this one, who has just been a really bad fill-in cornerback for Malcolm Butler over the last 2 weeks. And really on the season, he's played about a combined, when you factor in other snaps, about 4 games worth of snaps there. Conley's not a guy who I really have a lot of interest in, but in the low 4K wide receiver range, last week he saw 8 targets, second only to Sharks' explosion week of 15. So caught 6 balls for 58 yards, just a low-owned type of player who has some upside if he finds the end zone for Jacksonville. Fournette is going to have interest too.
Okay. On the Tennessee side, Derrick Henry, like we know we know what type of involvement he's going to have. He's had 2 monster games back to back. Of course, 188 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns against Kansas City. That run defense, man, I don't know how many times I gotta say it's terrible, but they're not on the slate. And Derrick Henry's $6,900. The passing weapons in this one, AJ Brown and Corey Davis. I'm not sure if he's going to play. I guess we'll find out. But I mean, just highly disappointing last time with Corey Davis out. Adam Humphries had 1 reception that ended up going for a touchdown, so that's cool. But I mean, it was just across the board ugly outside of Derrick Henry.
Yeah, it was ugly outside of him. I honestly think that I never even look at, only a couple times, and I guess earlier we didn't talk about it, but like the Pittsburgh Steelers defense was the reason this was like the first time this earlier in the week I've looked at pricing for defenses just against Ryan Findlay. But I also looked at Jacksonville against Tannehill here. They're cheap, 2,800. They're honestly probably the thing I want the most from this game. The AJ Brown side of it, him as a receiver, he's looked very underwhelming so far, even on a decent amount of snaps. They're still rotating through receivers. If Corey Davis does come back, it's still a tough matchup, probably against Boye there, but it's a spot that I'd have some interest in if I had to pick somewhere. Henry is priced up to a point where there's just other guys around him who catch the ball, and even if they're in similarly difficult matchups, I'll get to them more, or similar matchups overall, I'll get to them more. It's pretty much a neutral matchup on the ground for run blocking advantage this week, -6% according to Pro Football Focus for Tennessee. He's going to see enough volume that doesn't really matter for him. It's pretty neutral, so he's not a priority just because of the price tag, and he just doesn't catch the ball.
I think we can move on to the last one here.
Yeah, I mean, the more we go through this slate, there's just a lot of gross matchups.
Dude, it's crazy, right? I think when you look at this, you got Buffalo, Denver, Chicago, New York Giants, and like I said, if we can nitpick and say, oh, well, I like a player from that game, but mostly ugly games. Cincinnati, Pittsburgh. I think Cleveland, Miami's got a few things. Detroit, Washington doesn't have much at all. Seattle, Philadelphia, not a highly appealing game. Tennessee, Jacksonville. And then we get to New England and Dallas. And I don't know how much we're going to like here either. I will say this much just to start it off, Sal. I do think that, first of all, 46 over under, the Patriots are 6.5 point favorites at home. I do think that Ezekiel Elliott is too cheap here. And once again, when you've got guys like Gilmore and McCourty taking away Amari Cooper and Gallup, I think Dak Prescott will still get a little bit going through the air. He's had a great season, but I would also expect Ezekiel Elliott to be featured heavily here. His efficiency has been underwhelming. There's no question about that, particularly of late in some tough matchups and some good matchups. But he's still getting in the end zone. He's still getting those opportunities every single week, and he'll be the only one to do so. I know Pollard was involved a little bit last time out, but Ezekiel Elliott is now the cheapest that he's been all season long. So what do you think about Zeke here against New England at 7,500?
Yeah, I think he's one of the better, all the way up to the top. McCaffrey, so much more expensive, I think is my favorite play, but I think Zeke slides in is probably my second favorite play on this slate. There's just no value. And if you can get to mid-range running backs with a volume of, and I'm going to pull it up here, somewhere in the mid-20s, I believe it is. And right now Zeke is averaging. So he gets right now 23.1 opportunities per game, 19.4 carries per game is top 5 on the slate, as you'd expect, but he's getting 23.1 opportunities per game. He still has a decent pass catching role of about 4 targets per game. Yeah, he's too cheap. And I get it. The defense for the Patriots, and similar to last week, is what I was trying to echo about the Philadelphia Eagles. And we were talking a little bit about Jordan Howard early in the week, is this Patriots run defense isn't great. I mean, right now they're ranked, I think it might be a little bit off and they're probably changing things, but they're ranked 29th in overall run defense, according to Pro Football Focus.
I know.
It's not a good one tackling team, but 2 run stop team. You just don't stay into a lot of games so far this season. And if you look at their schedule and some of the quarterbacks they've faced, it's just not a lot of situations where they have faced teams that keep them within a touchdown, like last week with the Eagles. And even then, you get 18 to 20 carries. So if you're going to tell me that Zeke is going to see, again, leading the league in goal line or red zone and goal to go rush attempts, if he's going to see 20 plus opportunities or touches in this game, it's really nice for 7,500. I mean, Leonard Fournette stands out for $200 less as a guy who sees similar volume in this spot in probably a much more difficult matchup, better passing game role. So they kind of profile out the same for me, but how often you're going to get Dallas in the red zone compared to Jacksonville, I think is a little bit more. So yeah, I think Zeke is probably the best play in that 7K range.
Yeah. And you bring up the point of New England being according to Pro Football Focus, at least a bottom 5 run defense this season. They haven't exactly faced a ton of great rushing attacks. They didn't even have Jordan Howard because he was injured last game. So I'm not going to say, they held the Eagles to 82 rushing yards, they must be improving. Well, Boston Scott was out there getting a large amount of work. So what do you really expect? You face a good run team, and I think things will change around. That price tag for me, though, is just too appealing. Now, with that said, I have a tough time finding a lot of interest in an Amari Cooper here or a Gallup. I mean, it's a very good pass defense, man. And while a Cooper's price tag has definitely come down, DraftKings has preemptively priced him down because of this matchup. I still don't know if I want to get to these guys.
Yeah, they priced both of them down. Cooper a ton, 6,600, Gallup 5,900. Yeah, you have Cooper right now. Jerry Jones came out today and said that he should be able to play this weekend. He's dealing with a knee and an ankle injury that forced him from the last game. So you also have La'el Collins, who's going to be questionable for this one. So that obviously hurts the pass blocking game. Earlier in the season when they lost Tyron Smith for a couple of games, that hurt much more for Zeke, but not the passing game. So this is that hurt much more for Zeke, but not the passing game. So this is a much worse situation here with La'el Collins going down, and we'll see if he's going to be back. But either way, a banged up offense against probably right now ranks as a top 3 secondary. It's not a great spot, man. It's just tempting with how much Amari Cooper's price tag has come down. He's beat tough matchups all year long, outside of maybe had an average floor type of game against Marshawn Lattimore. So yeah, I'm probably not going to get there. It's just crazy to see it drop by $1,100. But yeah, it's all because of the matchup.
What about the New England Patriots? Pretty much stymied last week by the Philadelphia Eagles defense. Now you've got Dallas here, home in Foxborough. But in terms of salaries, like Sanu, reasonably priced, Edelman, reasonably priced. Sonny Michel's just been completely incompetent on the ground. And, James White, you and I have talked about this a lot. You pretty much know what you're getting from James White. He's a guy that gives you 10 to 15 fantasy points every week and should probably be a mid 4K player, but he isn't. So anything really stand out to you for the Patriots before we wrap this up?
Yeah, so I think injuries are going to play a big role here. Dorsett was called out for the rest of the game with a concussion, so he's in the protocol. We'll see what happens with Dorsett. Mohamed Sanu got banged up in that last game, but was able to come back in. If Dorsett is out, I think you probably see N'Keal Harry, their first-round pick, jump over Jacoby Myers in terms of playing on the outside. Myers they've used more in the slot as sort of a backup slot receiver to Edelman. So that seems a little bit interesting in this offense, but on the outside, he'll have to face rotations of guys like Byron Jones, and that's not great. The biggest thing here that stands out is, James White. I'll echo that. He's just sort of a above or overpriced slot wide receiver for what you get a 6 or 7 target game, and he'll probably finish like 40 or 50 yards. It's just not great if he doesn't find the end zone. Even if he does, it's probably not winning you a tournament most weeks. But Julian Edelman is the one that stands out. The price point comes down from last week by a good amount. I think $700. He leads the league in red zone and end zone targets this year, 18 red zone targets. So he's just a high upside player who obviously has the trust of Tom Brady. You're not going to get Gronk back this week. Gronk's announcement was that he's hosting a music festival and not coming back to the Patriots today.
I mean, it was clearly a troll.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the guy's down, 120 pounds? I don't know how he's going to just come right back out. He was
trolling, yeah. I mean, yeah, of course.
So now you get Julian Edelman is just obviously still going to be the guy in the middle of the field. Edelman's the guy at 6,900 for me. Jordan Lewis, though, has taken over the slot over the past month for the Cowboys and looked very good in the slot, but he hasn't faced somebody of the caliber of Julian Edelman yet. So, yeah, another game where there's two nice defenses or guys are just priced up to spots where I don't want them. I think it's Edelman and Sanu from the Patriots, and Edelman stands out as like the guy who, if anything, is a priority.
Okay. So basically, Edelman, Sanu, and Ezekiel Elliott.
Yeah, that's all that really stands out for the most part. I mean, you could punt Jason Witten, but I think there's better options.
All right. Hey, hit us with a thumbs up if you enjoy the show. It does help support us here so we can keep putting free content out at youtube.com/awesemo. Check us out over at awesemo.com as well, AWESEMO.com. Use that sign-up code NFL Strategy to get 50% off your first month. Sal, where can they find you?
Yeah, you can find me over on Twitter at SalVetriDFS. I'll be back here tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. on the Awesemo channel talking NBA strategy with Josh Engelman. Thursday back with Lofty at 11 a.m. breaking down the slate. And then on Saturday with Chris Randone. I also have a YouTube channel you can check out if you'd like more fantasy content. Just my name, Sal Vetri.
All right. Well, hey, that'll do it for us. Thanks for hanging out as always. A lot coming up throughout the day right here at youtube.com/awesemo. You know where to find us. You've got today, PGA Picks with Ben and Tim. You got the strategy show for NHL. Jake and Nolan going to take you through 5 p.m. on that one. And then the deeper dive, Adam Scher and myself. Then Eddie and Chris Randone have Live Before Lock coming up after that. So a lot here. Don't go anywhere throughout the day. We'll see you back here tomorrow. Chris Baggs and myself, Dave Lockren, on the NFL Strategy Show presented by Yahoo Daily Fantasy Sports.